It haunts me to think that there are people out there that could just throw somebody away like that.
A brutal killing.
Her body was in a state of decomposition. She had gone through cycles of freezing and then thawing.
It was either she stayed or she wasn't going at all.
A dark mystery with more questions than answers.
She was screaming and crying. She was telling us that it wasn't true, that we were lying.
She said, if I ever find out you're messing around with my husband, I'll kill you.
There's no question of the husband is going to be someone that's going to be looked at.
There's only one person that had the opportunity to commit this murder.
The truth will be revealed.
When people are competing for love, we're prepared to act like animals.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. On the coast of northern New England lies the picturesque city of Portland, Maine.
Portland's a small city. I mean, it's only about 65, 70,000 people. It's a very quaint place to be. It's extremely nice.
Murder is very uncommon in Portland. Violent crime is very low.
Where you have a large metropolitan area having hundreds of murders per year, Portland, you might go 3 or 4.
But on a gray and chilly January afternoon, factory worker Carrie Scott receives a phone call about his missing SUV.
Carrie Scott had attempted months prior to report his car had been stolen. He was told at the time that it was joint property because he was married. So no actual official stolen report was put out. Fast forward 2 months, and Carrie's friend happened to be walking through the motel parking lot, and he saw the red SUV.
He looked, he said, boy, that looks like Carrie's vehicle. And so he called Carrie and said, hey, is your plate number, and gave the plate number.
Carrie said, that's my truck, I'm gonna come out and get it.
Carrie's car had disappeared after being borrowed by his estranged wife, Margarita Scott.
So Carrie gets to the motel and went around to the driver's side. Then he decided he opened up the back door. And when he looked in, he saw it was, in fact, his wife, Margarita.
He immediately backed away from the vehicle. He didn't try to pull her out of the vehicle to see if she was okay or anything like that. It was clear that Margarita had been there for some time.
I can only imagine how terrifying that was for him to see after all that time.
To discard somebody in the way Rita was found, I mean, she was, shoved behind the seat of a vehicle and then left. I can't think of anything more degrading than that. It haunts me to think that there are people out there that have the ability to not only commit the crime, but then to just throw somebody away like that.
The way Margarita Scott's body is found provides few answers about what actually happened to her and raises more questions about who she was and what her life was like.
Margarita Scott, she was a really sympathetic figure. She was an immigrant to the country, but she graduated from the local high school. She was working hard to make a life for herself in America. The people who loved her cared very deeply for her.
Tasked with investigating Margarita Scott's murder are veteran homicide detectives Rich Vogel, Carl Rybeck, and Scott Pelletier.
When we arrived, there was snow on the ground. It was cold. I noticed already that there were not a lot of people around, which for me is a good thing. I'm always thinking about, okay, scene preservation.
And so we went up, opened the doors, and looked at what we had. Me, personally, I thought it was a sex crime had taken place. It just looked like something gone really bad. And then the whole story started developing.
Margarita's body was in a state of decomposition. She had gone through cycles of freezing and then thawing just due to the fluctuation in the temperatures and being in the back of the car. She had sustained a gunshot wound to her neck. The gun probably was a .40 caliber high point.
There was no signs within the vehicle that there was any type of struggle. There was no ballistics. We didn't find any gunpowder residue. We did not find any bullet holes. Minimal blood.
We know there was a gun fired and the bullet's not in the body, so the bullet's got to be somewhere. We're now looking for a crime scene.
When you see a drive and dump, or you see a victim in the woods, or you see, like in this case, a victim concealed in a car, the question is, where did this murder happen? Because that's where most of your evidence will be left behind. And until you find that, you're sort of behind the 8 ball.
Detectives begin their investigation into Margarita Scott's murder by focusing on the last 24 hours of her life, starting with her husband, Carrie.
The person that knows Margarita the best, obviously, would be her husband. So we were very interested in speaking with him right off the bat to get the initial story behind what would have led Margarita to end up in the back seat of the car found in a motel parking lot.
When brought in for questioning, Carrie Scott tells detectives that he last saw his estranged wife 2 months earlier, on November 10th.
Carrie and Margarita had been together for at least 8 years. They met in Florida and eventually moved back to Maine so Margarita could be closer to her family.
The marriage between Margarita Scott and Carrie Scott was, I think it's safe to say, a unique one. They had both come from Kazakhstan. At the time that she had gone missing, they were split up. They had sort of gone their separate ways.
She wanted to be out of the house doing things more fun. Carrie was a workaholic. He worked for a factory here in Portland, building components for cars. He would work very odd hours, go to work at 2 o'clock in the morning and work till whenever, and it was just hard. They had different lives and different schedules going. They were fighting more, and she seemed to get tied up with some rough people. He really loved her, but I think things were just out of hand. He didn't know how to fix it. So she had kind of moved out, and he had no idea where she had been going and staying.
Carrie tells the detectives that he still believed he and Margarita might get back together.
The day that Carrie last saw her, she had stayed with him at their place in Westbrook over the course of a night or a couple of previous nights.
But reveals that when he arrived home from work on November 10th, Margarita wasn't alone.
Carrie comes home, and this is when he finds her with Anthony Pratt.
Carrie explains that Margarita had recently started dating Anthony Pratt, a young man from New York, during her separation from Carrie.
It seems as though Carrie Scott knew what was going on at the very least. He seemed to understand that Margarita Scott had a relationship with Anthony Pratt. He, I guess, was willing to get over it in the short term because he maybe felt like she would come back to him eventually.
Carrie says Margarita told him she wanted to come back home, this time for good. At 2:30 p.m., Carrie agrees to drive Margarita and Anthony back to the apartment where they've been staying.
The plan was to drop Anthony off and Margarita to get her belongings and come back with Carrie.
Now, she wouldn't let Carrie drive them directly to the house because she did not want Carrie to know where she had been staying. So they wanted to be dropped off at the Cumberland Farms, and he was not to follow them.
He waited there for 30 to 45 minutes, and Margarita never returned, and he just assumed that she had left him, that that was the final straw, and she had chosen Anthony over him.
There's a basic principle in criminology and psychology that the avoidance of pain is a more powerful motivator than the pursuit of pleasure. So his tolerating this infidelity, his preparing to be humiliated and drive his wife and her paramour around is actually a better trade-off than being without her. But in spite of all that support, if you want to call it that, circumstances don't change. She still ends up dead, and he's the prime suspect.
The detectives ask Carrie how Margarita ended up with their SUV on November 10th.
Sometime during the early evening of the 10th, around 8 o'clock, she came back to the house in Westbrook, and she had a spare key because they shared the vehicle. She then took the vehicle and went back to where she had been staying, in the Cumberland Farms neighborhood.
He received a message from Margarita. Just said, Carrie, I apologize for taking the vehicle. I know you have to go to work. I'll bring the vehicle back at 2. Carrie was angry. He had to be to work. So he began to call to try to get a hold of Margarita. And she never responded.
He thought that she finally left him, and she went to New York with the boyfriend. And so Carrie turned around and went to the Westbrook police to report his vehicle missing. It was determined the vehicle was registered to both of them. So Westbrook police said, well, we can't take a stolen report on the vehicle because it's rightfully hers as much as it is yours.
To the detectives, a number of elements of Carrie's story just don't add up.
Anytime you're gonna have a homicide like that, the husband is gonna be someone that's gonna be looked at. Carrie's whole demeanor through this whole thing made us pause. Here you're talking about this woman that you love and all this other stuff, and the things that he allowed to happen, it was just crazy to me. I think one motive would have been jealousy right off the bat. And, you know, he would have had opportunity if she was at the house.
Jealousy is a hair-trigger response justified by the fact that someone else is trying to take from them something that they value. When people are competing for our resources, which includes love, we're prepared to act like animals.
Detectives have zeroed in on their first suspect in Margarita Scott's murder. Her husband, Carrie.
He's the last one to see her. She's missing, the vehicle's missing.
In order to narrow down their timeline and determine if Carrie is their killer, the detectives need to establish when the SUV first arrived in the motel parking lot.
Basically what we did is we went back and we looked at police calls for service that happened at the motel. So as officers would spin through the lot, when their cameras were on, we would see the red SUV parked there. The first time that we saw it was on November 11th at 2:38 in the morning.
The detectives can now be certain that the SUV with Margarita's body inside appeared in the parking lot just 6 hours after she borrowed the vehicle from Carrie, making her time of death between 8 p.m. and 2:38 a.m.
How did the vehicle get there? Obviously, we wanted to know that.
What happened to Margarita Scott during those 6 hours?
Maybe he was totally mad about what she was doing, and he's had enough of it. He gets into a quarrel with her out of the jealousy he has. It gets violent, and he kills her.
Jealousy can drive a person to kill, to hurt, to stalk. It's basically an insecurity in that person. And then when it gets really bad, your relationship is pretty much done. But they don't want it to end. They'd rather lose that person than have anyone else have that person in their life.
When detectives questioned Carey about where he was at 2:30 a.m. when the SUV carrying Margarita's dead body was seen arriving at the motel, he tells them he was at work from 2:00 a.m. until 2:00 p.m. on November 11th.
When we went back and did the forensics on Carey's cell phone, as well as the interviews of his employers, his friends, his neighbors, we were able to show that everything that Carey told us about where he was, the time frames that he gave us, they all matched up.
We were able to see through phone records on Margarita's phone all the times that he was calling, looking for her, leaving voicemail messages. He noticed that the credit card was being used in New York. So he had every indication that she was alive and possibly living in New York.
With Carey placed solidly at work from 2:00 a.m. until 2:00 p.m., he couldn't have killed Margarita and dropped the body at 2:38 a.m. The detectives then turned their focus to the new boyfriend, Anthony Pratt, who Carey says Margarita was with on the day she disappeared.
When we interviewed Carey, and he began to tell us the dynamics between him and Margarita and how their marriage was not the greatest, but that they were working on it. We were first introduced to Flacco, or Anthony Pratt. Part of our investigation obviously identified where Anthony Pratt and Margarita had been spending time. This was an apartment that was actually a home that was rented by Chris and Tennille Jennings.
Tennille and Christopher Jennings are a married couple with 2 young children, and Chris is a local drug dealer who is well known to Portland police.
Chris was also known by the street name of Red. Our investigation revealed that Chris had a history of drug trafficking. He's originally from New York. He traveled here to Maine with his wife and 2 children. They rented this home, and part of his job, the only job that Chris had, was distributing crack cocaine with Anthony Pratt.
Tracking down Anthony Pratt and Christopher Jennings becomes the detectives' top priority.
With the phone records, we were able to locate an address that Christopher was living at Concord Street in Portland.
We went to the apartment to check on these people, and we looked in the house, and it looked like nobody living on the first floor where they supposedly were supposed to be. And I contacted the landlord, and she told us she bought the building, and she told Jennings that they had to move, that she was going to do renovations and redo the apartment.
The evidence technicians went there and they started searching around, and they went into the basement and found a huge red-brown stain that was consistent with blood in the basement. And they were able to track it and follow it along the piping. Then they went upstairs and they found more blood in the baseboard and along the bottom of the door that went into the apartment.
A blood sample is sent to the lab for DNA testing, and the results come back with a positive match for Margarita Scott.
It now became a crime scene, as far as we were concerned. So, but the problem was everything had been torn out, so we didn't know what had happened.
The destruction of the Jennings' former apartment presents a serious setback for the investigation.
Tampering in a crime scene is ultimately fatal to the credibility of any evidence recovered from those scenes. In this case, we see not so much tampering as the destruction of the scene, to the point that anything found there later on is going to be so substantially, dramatically different, you lack then the probable cause to make an arrest. And certainly, even if you make an arrest, you've got major issues in terms of meeting that reasonable doubt benchmark in court.
With evidence that Margarita was killed at the Jennings' old apartment, the detectives pursue an injunction to halt the renovation. Now their number 1 priority is to track down Chris and his wife Tennille and Anthony Pratt.
We found him through the landlord. She gave us an address, which she thought they had moved to for any mail or whatever. So we went and confronted them about Margarita, and they were quite shocked. And they actually thought that Margarita had gone to New York and she was with Anthony.
The detectives want to know when the Jennings last saw Anthony Pratt.
Chris tells us that on the morning of the 11th, Anthony had to return back to New York right away. He told Chris and Tennille that his grandfather was in dire need of him, and so he had to return because of Hurricane Sandy.
The detectives question the Jennings about their whereabouts on November 10th, the night Margarita Scott disappeared.
Both Chris and Tennille remembered the date specifically. And for us as investigators, who remembers 2 months ago? They both gave similar stories about what they did and where their whereabouts were on November 10th.
As the Jennings continue to talk to the detectives, a police search of their new home raises another red flag.
When they were checking the house, they went into the rooms, and they went into the bedroom, they went into the closet, and they noticed a door in the ceiling for the crawl space up above where they were. So they popped up the door to look in the thing, and when they did, they heard a thud hit. And then they pushed the door up and they looked, and there was a handgun.
It was a High Point Smith & Wesson .40 caliber handgun, possibly a murder weapon.
With the discovery of a .40 caliber handgun, the same caliber used to kill Margarita Scott, suspicion shifts to drug dealer Chris Jennings and his wife Tennille.
Chris might have been mad because maybe Margarita owes him money for drugs.
Detectives haul Chris and Tennille Jennings down to the station for questioning.
Chris and Tennille both stated that it was Chris's birthday, and so they had gone out that night into the Old Port. They were dropped off by Margarita sometime around 11 o'clock at night. They went to some clubs and bars.
Anthony and Margarita were supposed to be babysitting the kids on the night of the party. Margarita was set to come pick them up at 1 o'clock in the morning when the bars closed. Well, around 1 o'clock in the morning, the bars were closed and they emptied out, and Chris and his wife decided, since it's his birthday, they wanted to know if there was some place they could go until later hours.
They did not have their cell phone with them, so Tennille was able to ask somebody to borrow a phone. She called Margarita and spoke to Margarita and said, "Don't bother to come get us. We're going to take a cab over to one of the strip clubs and hang out, and we'll get a ride there. Where are you?" And she said, "I'm home with Anthony." Tennille tells us that she makes another phone call at around 2 a.m. from the club, and when she calls the house, she speaks to Anthony and asks, where's Margarita?
And he says, "I don't know." He says she left and she went to bring the truck back, and she's never come back.
It's around 3:30 in the morning. Tennille and Christopher took a cab from the strip club to their home, and when they arrived, they found Anthony laying on the couch with one of the children on his chest sleeping.
If Margarita's body was dropped at 2:38 a.m., about 40 minutes after the Jennings' second phone call home, the timeline shows both of them had the opportunity to kill her just after 2 a.m. and before they returned home at 3:30 a.m.
So Chris and Tennille went to bed. Then the next morning, Anthony Pratt woke up. He said he's got to get back to New York.
Once Anthony left to go back to New York, they might have had phone conversations, but they never saw him again. And they never saw Margarita either.
The detectives are still eager to know about the .40 caliber gun found in their home, the same caliber of weapon used to kill Margarita.
Initially, Chris and Tennille lied about having a gun or knowing anything about a gun, and they were questioned hard about that. And then finally, Chris Jennings admitted that he and Anthony had purchased it. Tennille didn't want the gun around the children, so they hid it up in the attic space in the closet.
But under intense questioning, Chris reveals a significant detail: that there had been a conflict between Tennille and Margarita that night.
Tennille was very jealous of the whole relationship between Christopher and Margarita. Tennille had been cheated on by Christopher in the past, so she was pretty antsy about the whole thing.
It's very dangerous to overlook a female as a suspect just because you assume more times than not it's a male. If you don't look at that female, that's the person that's going to get away with murder.
On the evening of the 10th, before Chris and Tennille went out, I don't know if she noticed her husband and Margarita were being over-friendly with each other, but she did make a comment to her, "If I ever find out you're messing around with my husband or anything, I'll kill you." Tennille, she could have discovered that, in fact, something did happen, and she was going to make good on what she said. There was a gun there. It was in her apartment. She had plenty of opportunity. And so that was a possibility, and a possibility we had to look at.
Is that a motive to kill? It has been in the past.
The love triangle motive, that's common because you have someone who is full of so much emotion towards two people. They may be upset at their lover. They may feel betrayed. And then towards the other person, they may feel an incredible amount of anger and the desire for revenge.
During the Jennings questioning, new DNA results come back from the lab, and the evidence is explosive.
Through a sex crimes kit, we found DNA, but we didn't know that at the time of the autopsy. A sex crimes kit will give us, hopefully, DNA of the last person to be intimate with Margarita.
And it was shown that Margarita had recent sex with Christopher. The timeline would be significant for that because the way Margarita was found, it had to have been a recent sexual encounter, probably on November 10th. So we have to look at Chris again.
We confronted Chris Jennings with this, and he finally said yes, he did have sex, and it was the days before his birthday. There was something going on at the house, a little disagreement, so he took Margarita and asked them to give him a ride to the store. And then they went up by Hall School, which is nearby, and in the parking lot, and he had sex with Margarita.
Could Tennille have found out about Chris and Margarita's sexual encounter? And if so, did she follow through on her threat to kill Margarita?
Jealousy. That would be the motive right there. A motive for Tennille to kill Margarita.
As the focus of the investigation shifts to Tennille Jennings, detectives want to find out what she knew about the relationship between Chris and Margarita.
Chris and Tennille all along would tell lies, and then we would question them about those lies, and we would have facts to back it up, and they would then tell us the truth after realizing that we knew what we were talking about.
Lying, obviously, is one of the fastest ways to derail an investigation. People may be lying because they have some involvement or they're looking to cover up either the role of themselves or somebody else in the crime. And this may have an actual catastrophic effect on the eventual investigation. Determining who's lying, something we call a veracity assessment. There's a number of techniques we can use to do this, but really, if you think about it, most people are actually pretty good lie detectors on their own. It comes from experience, it comes from intuition, it comes from street smarts, and a good investigator will have that in spades.
So Tennille starts to explain that she didn't know that Christopher and Margarita had been intimate. Tennille was screaming and crying. She was telling us that it wasn't true, that we were lying. Just did not take it well at all. And it was a genuine reaction. She was upset. If she knew anything about it, that would be the time that she would say something, if she was pissed off enough.
To confirm if Tennille is telling the truth, detectives dig deeper into her alibi.
We were able to track down the woman whose phone they borrowed in the old port, and she was able to confirm that on that particular night she remembers someone asking to use her phone, and that they were asking if there were any places that were open later, and Chris and Tennille were directed to the strip club, PT's, because it stayed open until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And then when they got to the strip club, they had a private dance, and they were trying to make a hookup with the dancer, so the dancer put Chris's phone number in her phone and called it 2 times, and those records were on Chris's phone at home.
So that placed them solidly at PT's until that time I'm on them.
With the Jennings alibis checking out, that means they couldn't have killed Margarita between 1 a.m. when they last spoke to her and 2:38 a.m. when the body was dropped. Chris then points the finger directly at Anthony Pratt, Margarita's boyfriend.
So he called Anthony on his cell phone, and he talked to Anthony. And he told Anthony, the police are here, they found Margarita, she's dead, and he confronted Anthony with all of this. And Anthony's reply is, well, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? Chris says, well, you killed her. What do you want me to do? That was his reply.
Anthony doesn't confess to Chris, but he doesn't deny having killed Margarita either. To the detectives, the phone call puts Anthony in a whole new light.
So even with the fact that Chris had sex with Margarita earlier and that Tennille had made a threat that she would kill Margarita, at the end of the day, when we looked at everything, the forensics, the interviews, the timeline only shows there's only one person that had the opportunity to commit this murder and to do it in the location that it happened was Anthony Pratt.
I see Anthony Pratt as a young man who's an under-controlled batterer, someone who engages in violence to exert his superiority and regain control of the relationship. Sometimes people like this almost see women as property, right? As something to be owned or ownership. And so if you're not achieving those expectations or you're behaving differently, this angers these type of people. And there's no good ways that they know to respond other than to resort to violence. So in this situation, whether he's motivated by jealousy or maybe Margarita had said she's going to break up with him, these are factors that clearly aggravate him to the point that he becomes angry enough to perpetrate this act of domestic violence.
With Anthony, now the prime suspect in Margarita's murder, and at large in New York City, detectives step up their search by enlisting the help of the NYPD to track him down.
Finding someone in a city like New York who's gone AWOL in an investigation is like a needle in a haystack.
We were already 2 months behind the 8 ball when this whole case started. We needed to find Anthony Pratt before there was greater opportunity for him to flee.
I don't think there's any doubt in his mind that the police were now looking for him.
But then they catch a break, and Anthony returns Detective Vogel's numerous calls.
I kept it very light. I just said that, I wanted to talk to him. I heard that he was engaged to Margarita, and he had told me that he hadn't seen her, but he was willing to help out any way he could. And my thing was not to be antagonistic or aggressive in any way. I just wanted him to tell me his story. And so he had agreed to come to Portland.
Face to face with Pratt for the very first time, the detectives hope to finally get at the truth of who killed Margarita Scott.
You know something about this.
No, I do not know anything
Absolutely
about this.
you do.
They said they seen her in December, or I don't...
Nobody has seen her. Her family, her husband, nobody has seen her. When we started to ask him about certain things, and he would lie about them.
Rita takes Chris and Tennille into town, right?
Right.
Okay, so you're home watching the kids. Rita comes back there, does she?
Not that I know of.
Not that you know.
I don't know if...
Okay, well then, Tennille calls the house at 1 o'clock in the morning. Rita answers the phone. They tell her don't come pick her up. So that must put Rita back at the apartment, right?
I don't know.
You don't know.
He confirmed that Chris and Tennille had gone out that night, that it was Chris's birthday. and that Margarita had dropped them off, and then she never came back.
Anthony says that he left first thing the next morning to go to New York City, just like Chris Jennings had said.
It was so bizarre in the entire time from her disappearance to when she was found, Anthony Pratt never called, never tried to call her. And the phone records show that she was using her phone to call him because most of the calls on her records on her phone were from her husband trying to find her until the phone died.
The evidence against Anthony Pratt is compelling, but entirely circumstantial.
Circumstantial cases are harder to prosecute because it relies on a lot of inferences from the evidence that is available. And so where prosecutors will say it should lead you to there, if the defense attorney can say actually it could lead you to A, B, C, then that means it's reasonable doubt. But if the prosecutor has physical evidence, DNA evidence, anything that's hard evidence to connect the dots, then the prosecutor is going to be more likely to get to that reasonable doubt threshold.
In an effort to build a stronger case against Anthony, detectives returned to the neighborhood of the Jennings' former apartment, where Margarita was last seen, to search for anyone who may have seen or heard anything unusual the night of the murder.
The canvas establishes the players who are in the neighborhood or in the area at the time of the crime. It captures the world in which this crime occurred. And these are very important people to come back to later, because while they may not have seen anything suspicious, investigators sometimes need to be asking them about something not suspicious or something seemingly harmless that they saw. That may actually be as important as what they deem to be suspicious.
Just doing a canvas of the neighbors. Nobody heard a gunshot, but there was a neighbor. She had gotten home from work in the early morning hours. She was watching a movie, and she went out on her front porch to have a cigarette, and it was 2 in the morning. She saw a black male with a hoodie carrying what she thought in her mind looked like a body. And then she convinced herself that she was seeing things. It was wrapped in trash bags, and the guy was having a difficult time carrying it, and went to a red SUV and opened up the back and discarded the item in the back of the SUV. There's no question Anthony Pratt is the one that murdered Margarita.
Detectives have an eyewitness account of a body being dragged from the Jennings' former apartment that fits perfectly within their timeline. We now know that Margarita Scott was killed between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock a.m. on November 11th.
Well, the timeline is very important, and I do it with all my major cases. It tells a definite story. There's no question. I mean, this is what happened.
Detectives place Anthony on the timeline and theorize that he killed Margarita in the Jennings' former apartment. But they need physical evidence, and the apartment has been ripped apart.
The evidence technicians had this grueling process of actually putting a jigsaw puzzle back together. The wooden paneling on the floor had to be picked up and placed on the walls to put it back together. As they did that, they lifted each piece, inspected it, and in one of the pieces of paneling, they located on the back side of the paneling what initially looked like maybe a piece of putty from somebody maybe spackling or something. And what it actually turned out to be was a piece of paper and a piece of chewing gum. Green chewing gum had been pushed through a hole and sealed with the gum. As they put the paneling back on the wall, they got to a spot where within the plaster, they were able to cut that piece out. And behind that, they were able to locate an actual bullet.
So if you didn't look at your walls closely and didn't see it, you would have never noticed this little piece of paper covering a hole stuck there with gum.
Evidence was sent to the state crime lab for ballistics on the bullet, as well as DNA for the chewing gum. The bullet that was recovered could only have been fired from a High Point Smith & Wesson .40 caliber handgun.
Connecting the bullet to the same kind of weapon that was used to kill Margarita Scott is a significant step forward. But detectives still need physical evidence to directly link Anthony Pratt to the weapon.
The cheek swab that was sent out for Anthony's DNA came back positive that it was his DNA on the chewing gum that was placed in the hole. We know by that he had to have been at that scene. There's just no two ways around it.
The detectives are now able to piece together Margarita Scott's final 24 hours.
Margarita would have stayed with Carrie on November 9th. November 10th, Carrie took Anthony and Margarita to Chris and Tennille's house. The plan was to drop Anthony off and Margarita to get her belongings and come back with Carrie. She never did. It was Chris Jennings' birthday. Margarita did take them out around 11 o'clock at night. Sometime after 1 a.m. on the 11th, she got a call from Tennille using a stranger's phone saying, "Don't bother picking us up, we're gonna stay out."
I believe his anger toward the fact that she still was returning home, that was the last straw. I think that she was ready to leave and was going to return that truck to her husband and probably stay at her own home like she's been doing regularly, and Anthony was gonna have no part of that. It was either she stayed or she wasn't going at all. Based on all the evidence that we were able to obtain, Anthony shot Margarita in the living room floor of that home. He picked her up, took her outside, dumped her in the back of that red truck, drove the red truck. It's less than 2 miles from the home to the motel's parking lot.
On April 2nd, 2013, Anthony Pratt is arrested for the murder of Margarita Scott. He's found guilty and sentenced to 42 years in prison.
I think it was almost more for the family that you don't want to let them down. It's the most serious offense when someone's life is taken, and there is a lot of pressure from friends and family to find out who did it.
I still wake up every morning and I still think police work is an honorable job. There are always going to be a faction of society that does not play by the rules, and somebody has to keep those people in check.
It was a difficult case from the very beginning, but pieces fell together out of just hard work, of old-fashioned police work in some sense, of just pounding the beat, and justice was done.